My son sold his home for $750,000 and handed every dollar to his wife. She burned through it all, then arrived at my door with 3 suitcases demanding to move in. So I opened the door, with a 3-foot python wrapped around my arm. "Get that disgusting, slithering monster out of my face, or I'll burn this godforsaken house to the ground." Lennox screamed, her expensive designer coat fluttering as she stumbled backward down my front steps. My son Terrence stood frozen beside 3 massive leather suitcases, his face pale and eyes wide with desperation. "I told you, Lennox," I said calmly, letting Jimmy, my 3-foot ball python, drape comfortably around my forearm. "Jimmy lives in the guest room. If you want a free place to stay after throwing away $750,000, you share the room with him. That's my offer." Just 3 days ago, Terrence called to tell me they had sold their beautiful suburban home for $750,000. I thought they were upgrading. Instead, Terrence handed the entire cash payout to Lennox, who managed to burn through every cent on failed luxury boutiques, private jet rentals for her friends, and risky day trading. Now penniless and facing eviction from their rented condo, they showed up at my door, expecting a free ride. "Mom, please," Terrence pleaded, his voice cracking. "We have nowhere else to go. The bank froze our remaining accounts. Just let us stay for a few weeks." "You sold your future to satisfy her vanity, Terrence," I replied, looking my 32-year-old son straight in the eye. "I spent 20 years working double shifts as a hospital receptionist to help you pay for college. I won't let you drag my peaceful retirement into your chaos." "You're a heartless old woman!" Lennox shrieked, her manicured hands shaking with rage. "He's your flesh and blood. You owe him." I stroked Jimmy's smooth scales, feeling the steady heat of the afternoon sun on my porch. I owed him a good upbringing, which I gave him. I don't owe an entitled adult a hideout from his own terrible choices. Accept my roommate or find a motel. Lennox spat on my walkway, turned on her high heels, and marched back toward their battered sedan, leaving Terrence standing alone under the harsh shade of my oak tree. Terrence stayed in the driveway for an hour after Lennox stormed off. I watched him through the kitchen window as I prepped Jimmy's enclosure. Part of my heart ached. No mother wants to see her child broken, but enabling him had to end today. Eventually, he knocked softly on the back door. When I opened it, he looked smaller than he had in years. "She left to stay with her sister," Terrence whispered, staring at his boots. "Can I at least sit down, Mom? Just for a cup of coffee?" I stepped aside, letting him enter, though I kept Jimmy resting safely inside his glass terrarium in the living room. Terrence sank into the kitchen chair, burying his face in his calloused hands. "How did you let it get this far?" I asked softly, setting a mug in front of him. $750,000, Terrence. That was your equity. Your safety net. She kept promising it was an investment. He admitted, his voice barely audible. First, it was the high-end clothing line that went under in 6 months. Then she wanted to fund a lifestyle to attract rich investors. Every time I said no, she threatened to leave me. I thought if I just gave her what she wanted, she'd finally be happy, and we could build a real life. "You traded your dignity to keep a woman who uses you as a checkbook," I said firmly. "I know I messed up, Mom." He looked up, his eyes red. "I blamed you for being harsh, but when I saw you holding Jimmy today, standing your ground, I realized I haven't stood my ground in 5 years. Standing up for yourself isn't cruelty, Terrence." I took a sip of my coffee. "It's survival. I bought this little house on my own after your father left us with nothing. I learned the hard way that if you don't set boundaries, people will walk right over you and complain you aren't flat enough. 2 days later, I was tending to my backyard garden when the side gate slammed open. I turned to find Lennox, accompanied by an older woman with sharp eyes and a matching fur coat, her mother Beverly. "There she is," Beverly sneered, stepping onto my lawn without an invitation. "The woman starving my daughter out on the street." I carefully set down my trowel and stood up, wiping my dirt-stained hands on my apron. "Beverly, Lennox, you're trespassing. We're here to collect what's fair," Lennox snapped, standing boldly behind her mother. "Terrence paid $15,000 toward your roof repair 2 years ago. We consider that an equity stake in this house. We want our money back, or we're moving in today." I almost laughed at the absurdity. "Terrence gave me that money as a birthday gift because he wanted to help after a hailstorm. There was no contract, no equity agreement, and certainly no invitation for you to bully me on my own property. We'll see what a judge says about it," Beverly yelled, stepping closer and thrusting a finger toward my face. "You manipulated your son into giving you cash while letting his marriage crumble." Suddenly, the back door opened. Terrence stepped out onto the patio. He had been staying at a local budget motel, but he'd come over that morning to help me move heavy soil bags. "Leave my mother alone, Beverly," Terrence said, his voice surprisingly firm. Lennox gasped, turning to her husband. "Terrence, tell her you're taking your share of this house so we can pay off our debts." Terrence looked at Lennox, then at her mother, and finally at me. For the first time in years, the haze of submission seemed to lift from his eyes. "Mom doesn't owe us a dime," Terrence stated clearly. "I gave her that money freely when I actually had an income. You spent our entire house fund on useless junk, Lennox. Stop harassing my mother." Beverly looked stunned while Lennox's face twisted into a mask of pure fury. "You coward!" Lennox shrieked at Terrence. "You're taking her side over your wife after everything I gave up for you. What did you give up?" Terrence countered, stepping between them and my garden patch. "My savings, my home, my self-respect. You haven't worked a single job since we got married, Lennox. I took out a second mortgage because you insisted on living in a luxury zip code. I deserved a good life," she screamed. "Not at the expense of mine," Terrence yelled back. It was the first time I had ever heard my son raise his voice to her. Beverly grabbed Lennox's arm, sensing the tide turning. "Come on, Lennox. Let the loser rot with his mother. We'll get a lawyer." "Go ahead," I called out as they backed toward the gate. "My house is paid off, my property taxes are current, and I have security cameras recording every inch of this yard. If I see either of you step foot on my grass again, I won't call a lawyer, I'll call the police." They slammed the gate shut, leaving a heavy silence hanging over the yard. Terrence slumped onto the wooden bench near my rose bushes, his shoulders shaking slightly. I walked over and sat down beside him, placing a hand on his back. "I was so blind, Mom," he whispered, wiping a tear from his cheek. "I thought loving someone meant sacrificing everything you have to make them happy. Love isn't a ransom, son," I said gently. "If someone truly loves you, they want you to be secure, not drained dry. I made my own mistakes with your father. I stayed too long trying to fix a man who preferred his vices over his family. I was wrong to let that go on, and you were wrong to enable Lennox. I don't even know who I am without her demands," he admitted softly. Over the next 2 weeks, the reality of their financial ruin hit hard. Lennox filed for a legal separation and immediately demanded spousal support. However, because she had squandered the $750,000 from the house sale on documented luxury expenses, her claims of financial hardship were met with severe scrutiny by the court mediator. Terrence moved into a small one-bedroom apartment near the train station and took an entry-level logistics job. It paid half of what he used to make, but it was honest work. Every evening after his shift, he would drop by my house for an hour, not to ask for money, but to help with chores and talk. One evening, he sat on the living room rug, tentatively watching Jimmy slide across his glass tank. "He's actually kind of peaceful," Terrence noted, chuckling weakly. "He minds his own business and only eats what he needs." I smiled, placing a plate of stew on the table for him. Humans could learn a lot from reptiles. "I got a letter from the bank today," Terrence said, his smile fading. "They're auditing our tax returns from last year. Lennox claimed business deductions for her boutique that didn't exist. I signed those papers without reading them because she told me to." My stomach dropped. "Terrence, that's tax fraud." "I know," he sighed, leaning his head against the sofa. "I might face fines, or worse. I was so eager to avoid a fight with her that I signed away my legal protection." "You were right to turn us away that day, Mom. If you had let us move in, I would have kept hiding behind you instead of facing this mess." I sat beside him, taking his hand. "I wasn't right about everything, Terrence. I should have spoken up years ago when I saw her manipulating you. I stayed quiet because I was afraid of losing you. That was my own weakness." The tax audit was brutal. Terrence had to spend his weekends digging through shoeboxes of receipts, bank statements, and credit card bills. What he discovered was worse than he imagined. Lennox had secretly opened 2 store credit cards in his name, running up an additional $28,000 in debt before the house was even sold. Instead of hiding, Terrence hired a local defense attorney using a small loan he secured on his own merit. He took full accountability for his negligence while providing proof that Lennox had forged his signature on several financial documents. One afternoon, I accompanied him to his lawyer's office downtown. "Your willingness to cooperate with the IRS is your saving grace, Mr. Miller," the lawyer explained, sliding a folder across the desk. "Because you aren't hiding assets and are actively reporting the forgery, we can likely avoid criminal charges, but you will have to pay back the back taxes and penalties." "I'll work 2 jobs if I have to," Terrence replied without hesitation. "I just want my name clear." Watching him sit straight in that chair, taking full responsibility for his life, filled me with a quiet pride. He wasn't the timid boy who had backed down on my porch weeks ago. He was becoming a man grounded in reality. When we walked out into the crisp autumn air, Terrence looked up at the sky and took a deep breath. "It feels strange, Mom. I'm broke. I'm getting divorced, and I owe the government money. But for the first time in 10 years, I can actually breathe." "That's the sound of freedom, son," I said, wrapping my arm through his. "It's expensive, but it's worth every penny." Lennox, meanwhile, refused to accept her new reality. She tried to leak exaggerated stories about Terrence on social media, but without facts to back them up, her claims quickly fell apart under public scrutiny. 2 months later, we gathered in a sterile family courtroom for the final settlement hearing. Lennox sat across the aisle, dressed impeccably as always, but her mother was absent, and her lawyer looked visibly exhausted. When the judge reviewed the financial records, her expression remained stern. Lennox's team tried to argue that Terrence should bear the entire burden of the $28,000 credit card debt and pay $2,000 a month in alimony. "Your Honor," Terrence's lawyer stood up calmly. We have submitted forensic accounting records showing that Mrs. Miller spent $750,000 in liquid capital from the sale of the marital home within 20 months. Furthermore, we have handwriting analysis proving she signed my client's name to credit applications without his knowledge. The judge looked over her glasses at Lennox. Mrs. Miller, where did the proceeds from the house sale go? Lennox adjusted her collar, her voice trembling slightly. They were business investments and personal upkeep necessary for my brand. Your brand is not a legal entity, the judge stated bluntly. You squandered a fortune that belonged to both you and your husband. Claiming spousal support after consuming $750,000 of marital assets is legally absurd. The ruling was swift and uncompromising. The remaining joint debts were allocated proportionally based on fraud findings. Lennox was denied alimony completely and ordered to surrender her high-end designer items to be liquidated toward the tax penalties. As the judge slammed the gavel, Lennox broke down in dramatic sobs, blaming her lawyer, the judge, and the system. Terrence didn't gloat. He simply packed his papers into his briefcase, nodded respectfully to the judge, and walked out of the courtroom with a calm, steady stride. I met him in the hallway, offering a warm smile. "How do you feel?" "Relieved," he said softly, "and ready to rebuild." Spring arrived, bringing fresh blossoms to my garden and a sense of quiet peace back to my home. Terrence's life looked drastically different now. He lived modestly, paid his monthly tax installment on time, and spent his weekends taking night classes in financial management. One Saturday afternoon, he came over to help me build a new, larger wooden enclosure for Jimmy. He handled the electric saw with confidence, measuring the pine boards with care. "You know," Terrence chuckled, wiping sweat from his forehead, "I used to be terrified of this snake." "Fear usually comes from not understanding something," I replied, holding a piece of wood steady for him. "Once you realize Jimmy just wants boundaries and safety, he isn't scary at all. Just like life, I guess." Terrence smiled, securing a screw into place. "I used to think conflict was the worst thing in the world. I'd do anything to avoid a fight with Lennox, even if it meant destroying myself. But dodging conflict only creates a bigger explosion later. It took me 60 years to learn that lesson, Terrence." I admitted, looking around my modest, sunny yard. "When your father walked out, I spent years blaming myself, thinking I wasn't smart enough or pretty enough to make him stay. I let guilt rule my life for a long time, and I raised you with too much leniency because I wanted to protect you from pain." Terrence set the saw down and looked at me. "You didn't ruin me, Mom. You gave me a foundation. I just had to hit rock bottom to realize I needed to stand on it." We finished the enclosure together, placing Jimmy inside his spacious new home. The python stretched out contentedly under his heat lamp, completely unaware of the human drama he had indirectly helped resolve. A year after the porch incident, he ran into Lennox at a local grocery store. She was working behind the customer service desk, a stark contrast to the designer-clad woman who had once demanded my home. She froze when she saw me approaching the register to return an unopened bag of potting soil. For a second, I saw a flash of the old resentment in her eyes, but it quickly faded into a hollow exhaustion. "Hello, Lennox," I said, neutrally placing my item on the counter. She processed the return in silence, her hands trembling slightly as she handed me the receipt. "Is Terrence doing well?" she asked quietly, not meeting my eyes. "He's working hard, paying off his debts and finding his peace," I replied honestly. I thought I could have everything without paying the price." she whispered, looking down at the worn countertop. My mother always told me that appearance was all that mattered. Now I have nothing. I looked at this young woman who had caused so much pain, but I felt no desire to kick her while she was down. True justice had already taken place. Adding cruelty to it would only poison my own heart. It's never too late to build a real life, Lennox, I said gently. But you have to start by being honest with yourself. She blinked back tears and gave a small, hesitant nod as I picked up my receipt and walked out into the sunshine. I got into my car feeling a profound sense of closure. Life has a way of balancing the scales, not through grand acts of vengeance, but through the natural consequences of our choices. That evening, Terrence and I sat on my front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Jimmy rested peacefully in his outdoor transport cage beside my chair, soaking in the gentle evening breeze. Terrence poured 2 glasses of iced tea and handed one to me. I got promoted to assistant manager today, Mom. It's not a fortune, but my debt will be fully paid off by next summer. I never doubted you for a second once you found your footing, I said, clinking my glass against his. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that true maternal love isn't about rescuing your children from every storm. Sometimes the kindest thing a mother can do is shut the door, set a firm boundary, and force her child to grow the backbone they never knew they needed. I was far from a perfect mother. I had stayed silent for too long, letting my own fear of confrontation allow my son to slip into a destructive marriage. But when the defining moment came, I chose truth over comfortable lies. Holding my ground didn't destroy my family. It saved my son. Justice isn't about destroying those who harm us. It's about protecting what is right, standing firm in your values, and letting people face the harvest of the seeds they planted. As the stars began to appear over our quiet neighborhood, I took a sip of tea and smiled. My home was still mine. My son was finally a man, and peace reigned in my garden.
Glad you're here with me today. Follow along until the end and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. The first thing I noticed was that the pharmacist was not looking at me when she spoke. She was looking at the door. "Are you Nolan's mother?" she asked, her voice barely above a murmur, fingers still moving across the keyboard as though she hadn't said anything unusual at all. I told her I was. "My name is Beverly. No, wait, I'm sorry. Old habit. I go by my middle name now after my husband passed. People around here know me as June. June Whitaker, 64 years old, retired school librarian, living in a 2-bedroom house in Franklin, Tennessee that I have kept spotless for 31 years. I am not the kind of woman who causes scenes or invites drama. I clip coupons. I bring casseroles to sick neighbors. I water my tomatoes every morning at 7. But that afternoon at Ridgeway Pharmacy, something shifted in the air the moment that woman said my son's name. She leaned forward just enough that I could smell her hand lotion, something with lavender, and she said quietly, "I've seen things I think you should know about. His wife's family, they come in here a lot." She pulled back before I could respond, raised her voice to normal, and said, "That'll be $14.50 for the blood pressure prescription, Mrs. Whitaker." I paid. I walked out. I sat in my car in that parking lot for 11 minutes because my hands would not stop trembling. Nolan is my only child. He turned 35 last spring. His father died when Nolan was 9, pancreatic cancer. Fast and merciless. And from that point forward, it was the 2 of us against everything. I worked the reference desk at Belmont Elementary for 22 years. I picked up weekend shifts at the county library branch during summers. I drove a car with a cracked dashboard and worn brakes for 6 years because Nolan needed braces, then a laptop, then help with the deposit on his first apartment when he got the job at the civil engineering firm in Nashville. When he told me he was marrying Sasha, I tried. I truly tried. She was polished in the way of someone who had practiced being polished. Perfect posture, perfect highlights, a laugh that arrived exactly on cue. At the rehearsal dinner, her father, a large, loud man named Conrad who sold commercial real estate and told everyone about it, pumped my hand and said, "You raised one heck of a son, June. We're going to take good care of this family." Her mother, Deidre, pressed her cheek to mine and whispered that having Nolan in their lives was an answered prayer. I told myself the unease in my stomach was just nerves. Just a mother letting go. The first request came 3 months after the wedding. Sasha called Nolan during our Sunday dinner. She always called during dinner, and her voice through the speaker was wet with crying. Her father's business had hit a rough patch. They needed help covering the mortgage for 1 month, just until a deal closed. Nolan didn't hesitate. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand like he was reassuring me, and said into the phone, "Of course, send me the account number." I looked at my pot roast and said nothing. The requests continued the way water gets into a foundation, slowly, quietly, and then all at once. Conrad's truck needed a new transmission. Deidre's back surgery cost more than insurance covered. The property taxes on their house in Brentwood were due, and the bank account was overdrawn. Each crisis arrived with the same urgency, the same tearful phone calls, the same gratitude that evaporated the moment the money cleared. I started noticing the small things, the way Nolan checked his phone during our walks now, the crease between his brows that hadn't been there 2 years ago, the fact that he'd stopped talking about the Alaska fishing trip he'd been planning since college. Once, when I suggested he and Sasha join me for a birthday dinner at home to save money, he looked at the table and said Sasha preferred restaurants, said she needed that after long weeks, said it in a tone that meant he'd had this conversation with himself many times and already lost. I let it go. You learn to choose your battles when the person you love most has found someone else to love. But after the pharmacist's words, something I'd been pressing down for 2 years pushed back up. I did not go straight home. I drove the long way, past the Brentwood neighborhood where Conrad and Deidre lived. A quiet, wide-laned street with mature oaks and 3-car garages. I had been there once for a Christmas Eve gathering 2 years ago. The house was large and well kept, with landscaping that did not come cheap. As I slowed near the corner, I saw Conrad's silver pickup in the driveway. Not the truck with the broken transmission they had asked Nolan to help replace. A different truck, newer, the kind with chrome trim and running boards that gleamed even in overcast light. He was loading golf clubs into the bed, moving easy, laughing into a phone pressed between his shoulder and ear. "Yeah, Nolan came through again," I heard him say as I idled past. "Deidre can get the kitchen redone now. I told you he was the right one for our girl." I drove home. I made tea. I didn't drink. I opened the small notebook I keep in my nightstand for grocery lists and phone numbers, and on the first clean page, I wrote the date and what I had just heard. That notebook would become the most important document in my life for the next 4 months. The following week, I went back to Ridgeway Pharmacy and asked for the woman who had spoken to me. Her name tag said Fern. She was perhaps 40, with tired eyes and a careful way of choosing words, and when I told her I believed her and wanted to understand more, she glanced at the pharmacist behind the counter, then back at me. "My brother-in-law worked for Conrad Aldrich's about 3 years ago," she said quietly. "Commercial property deal. Conrad asked him to invest, said it was a sure thing. Took $12,000 and then the company dissolved. There was nothing to sue. It was all set up to look legitimate." She straightened a row of vitamins on the shelf beside us. "I've watched him come in here for 2 years. He buys wine by the case, expensive stuff, always pays cash." I asked if she would be willing to write down what she remembered about her brother-in-law's situation. She said she would think about it. I thanked her and bought a bottle of vitamin C I didn't need. That night, Nolan called. His voice had the tight quality it got when he was trying to sound calm. "Mom, I hate to even bring this up, but Conrad's had a medical scare. They think it might be something with his heart. Sasha's pretty shaken. The hospital is asking for a deposit before they run some of the more advanced tests, and I've had a lot of expenses this month." I gripped the phone. "Which hospital?" "Vanderbilt. Sasha's with him now. I'll come, I said immediately. Don't worry about the deposit yet. Let me come be with you. Silence on the line. Then, you don't have to do that, Mom. I want to, I said. Family shows up in person. Another pause, longer this time. Okay, I'll tell Sasha. I took a cab to Vanderbilt University Medical Center and walked straight to the information desk. I gave them Conrad Aldrich's name. The woman checked her screen twice and told me there was no patient by that name admitted that evening, or at any point in the past 48 hours. I found Nolan near the main entrance, pale and visibly exhausted. Sasha stood a few feet away, her eyes dry, her mascara intact, scrolling through her phone with the focused calm of someone who is not actually in crisis. When she saw me, something flickered across her face. Recalculation, I think. The kind that happens when a plan meets an unexpected variable. June, she said, you didn't need to come all this way. I wanted to be here, I said pleasantly. Which room is Conrad in? I'd love to check on him. They're still running the initial workup. We can't see him yet. I just spoke to the information desk, I said. They don't have him listed as a patient. The silence that followed was the kind that tells you everything. Nolan turned to look at his wife. Slowly, the way someone turns when they already suspect what they're going to see. Sasha, he said quietly. Is he here? She opened her mouth, closed it, started a sentence about paperwork errors, about the system sometimes not updating right away, about how these things happen. And then the main doors slid open and Conrad walked in. He was wearing a sport coat. He was carrying a leather portfolio. He was scanning the lobby with the expression of a man arriving late to a business dinner, not a man who had been rushed to a cardiac unit. When his eyes landed on the three of us standing there looking at him, he stopped walking. In that moment, every amount of money Nolan had ever wired to these people became absolutely clear. The drive back to my apartment that night was quiet. Nolan gripped the steering wheel and stared at the road and did not speak for a long time. When he finally did, he said, "How long have you known?" I told him I had suspected, that I had only recently started to understand the scale of it. "I've given them over $30,000, he said, in a tone so flat it scared me more than anger would have. In 2 years. For a mortgage that, I don't even know if they have a mortgage. For medical bills I never saw. For a truck transmission I apparently didn't need to pay for." He pulled into my parking lot and sat with the engine running. "What do I do, Mom?" "Tonight you sleep," I said. "Tomorrow we make a plan. I want to tell you that the hard part was over. But the truth is that uncovering a betrayal and dismantling it are two entirely different things. And the second one is much slower and much lonelier." Over the following weeks, Nolan and I worked carefully. He pulled every bank transfer, every wire, every Venmo record going back to the first month of the marriage. He built a spreadsheet with dates and amounts and stated reasons. A document that was devastating in its clarity. $31,400 for emergencies that had never existed. Fern at the pharmacy connected me with her brother-in-law, a soft-spoken man named Gil who agreed to provide a written statement about Conrad's fake investment scheme. A neighbor of the Aldriches, a retired teacher who had lived on their street for 12 years and knew I'd reached out through a mutual friend at my church, told me quietly that Conrad played golf 3 times a week at a private club, that Deidre had her kitchen fully renovated last summer, and that they had taken a 2-week trip to Portugal in the spring. The same spring Nolan had sent them money for emergency roof repairs. I wrote everything down. I kept every receipt, every statement, every text message Nolan forwarded to me. Then came the dinner invitation. Deidre called me on a Thursday evening, her voice honeyed and careful. She said she and Conrad wanted to clear the air. They were aware there had been some confusion and they felt terrible about it. They would love to have me over for Sunday lunch, nothing formal, just family. I accepted. Against every instinct, I accepted because I wanted to see what they would say to my face and because I knew Nolan needed me to. Their house was exactly what I expected and worse. The kitchen had new white cabinetry, quartz countertops, a farmhouse sink that still had the hardware store sticker half peeled off the faucet. A renovation that cost, conservatively, $25,000. In the dining room, Conrad poured wine from a bottle I recognized from a specialty shop on 12th Avenue, $65 a bottle. I knew because I had once looked at it and put it back. Deidre wore earrings I was certain were not costume. The house smelled like fresh paint and new money, which is to say it smelled like my son's overtime hours. Conrad did most of the talking. He used words like misunderstanding and cash flow and investment cycles. He said that of course they intended to pay everything back, that this had all been temporary, that family helps family through difficult seasons. He looked at me with the steady eyes of a man who had said these things many times to many people and had usually gotten away with it. I let him finish. Then I placed my folder on the table. I have bank records showing every transfer Nolan made to you, I said calmly, matched to dates when he believed you were in crisis. I have a statement from Gil Farrow describing the investment scheme you ran 3 years ago. I have a neighbor's account of your lifestyle during those same periods of supposed financial hardship. And I have a meeting scheduled with a detective at the Franklin Police Department on Tuesday morning to discuss what options exist for filing a formal complaint. This was not an exaggeration. Nolan's attorney had advised us to bring the documentation to law enforcement and let them assess it. That meeting was real. Conrad's face did something interesting. The smoothness left it. Deidre set down her wine glass. "What exactly do you want, June?" Conrad asked. His voice had changed. The warmth was gone, and what was underneath it was harder and much less charming. "Full restitution," I said. "Every dollar, with a signed acknowledgement of what it was taken for and under what pretenses. A legally binding agreement that you will never approach Nolan for money again, and your complete non-interference in the divorce proceedings." "Divorce?" Deidre repeated, as though I had said something in a foreign language. "Sasha and Nolan are separating," I said. "I imagine you know that." Conrad leaned forward. "You're making a serious mistake. We have resources. We have people in this community. One call and I can make things very difficult for your son professionally. I know people at his firm." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about the 18 years I had spent as a single mother, about the cracked dashboard and the worn brakes, about the overtime shifts and the coupons and the nights I had lain awake running numbers in my head so that no one would never have to know how close we sometimes came to the edge. "Conrad," I said, "I raised my son alone after his father died. I worked 2 jobs for the better part of a decade. I have faced harder things than you." I stood and picked up my folder. "You have 72 hours to contact Nolan's attorney with an agreement in principle. After that, I bring everything I have to the police and to your neighborhood association and to every person Gil Farrow can connect me with who lost money in your scheme." I left their beautiful, renovated house without touching the wine. Nolan was parked 2 streets away, waiting for me. When I climbed in, he looked at my face and said, "How did it go?" "They're scared," I said. "Good." They contacted the attorney in 41 hours. The negotiation took 2 weeks. Conrad tried 3 times to reduce the amount, citing cash flow, citing assets that were tied up, citing things that no longer worked on us. Each time, Nolan's attorney reminded them of the Tuesday meeting with a detective, which was real and which we kept, regardless of the negotiation, and each time something moved. The full amount was transferred in 2 installments, $31,400. The signed agreement was notarized and delivered. The divorce proceeded without interference. The detective we met with told us that based on what we brought, there was a pattern consistent with fraud, and that while prosecution was not guaranteed, the documentation we had was strong enough to open a formal inquiry. That inquiry is still open, as of the last time I checked. Conrad and Deidre listed their Brentwood house for sale 4 months after we filed. They moved to somewhere in Arizona. I don't know the city, and I have not looked. I am telling you this now from my kitchen in Franklin, Tennessee, on a Tuesday morning in October. Nolan called last night, later than he usually does, his voice loose and easy the way it gets when he has had a good day. He has been promoted at the firm. He is going on that Alaska fishing trip in June with 2 college friends. He has a savings account again. He told me he wants to help me replace my car next year. I told him absolutely not. That's his money. We argued about it the way we argue sometimes, both of us talking at once, and I was laughing by the end of it. I want to be clear about something because I have thought about this a great deal in the months since all of it happened. I did not enjoy any part of what I had to do. I did not enjoy the surveillance, or the confrontation, or the sight of Conrad's face when he realized he had underestimated a retired librarian from Franklin. I did not enjoy watching my son absorb the knowledge that the woman he had loved had been taking notes on his professional life for the benefit of her parents. That kind of grief doesn't resolve cleanly. It just becomes something you carry differently over time. But I also know this. The greatest act of love is sometimes the most uncomfortable one. It is refusing to stay quiet because quiet feels safer. It is holding firm when every part of you wants to give in just to stop the pain. Nolan called me brave once, a few months after everything was resolved. I told him I was just his mother. That is the same thing, he said. I think about the pharmacist, Fern, who took a risk to say something to a stranger in a vitamin aisle because she had watched something happen to someone she loved and wished, afterward, that someone had spoken up sooner. I brought her flowers the week the money was transferred. She cried a little. I did too. If you are watching this and you have a feeling, that low, persistent feeling that something is not right, that kindness is being mistaken for access, that love is being borrowed against without consent, trust it. Document it. You do not have to accuse anyone. You just have to pay attention. What would you do if you were in my position? Have you ever had to protect someone you love from the people closest to them? Leave me a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. If this story meant something to you, I hope you'll stay for the next one. I still think about the moment Conrad walked through those hospital doors in his sport coat, portfolio in hand, completely unaware that everything was about to stop working in his favor. I have replayed it more times than I can count. Not with satisfaction, exactly, but with the particular clarity that comes when you finally see a thing for exactly what it is. What happened to Nolan was not a run of bad luck. It was the predictable result of good character being treated as a resource to drain. He was raised to believe that you show up for people, that you don't ask for proof when someone you love says they're struggling. Conrad and Deidre understood that about him before he did. They chose him because of it. That is the part that still sits heavy in me, not the money. Though $31,000 is not nothing for a man living on an engineer's salary and a mother's careful savings. It's the targeting, the recognition that his kindness was the door they intended to walk through indefinitely. I think about what it took to stop it. Not bravery, exactly. I never felt braver, exactly. I never felt was responsible. I had spent 26 years teaching my son that doing right by people was its own reward, and I was not wrong about that. But I had not taught him enough about discernment. About the difference between generosity freely given and generosity that is being harvested. That is on me, at least in part, and I have made peace with it. What carried us through was something quieter than courage. It was the discipline to document instead of accuse, to watch instead of react, to build a case from facts rather than from feeling. Even when the feeling was overwhelming, Nolan did that. He sat with a spreadsheet and 31 line items of his own money, and he did not fall apart. He got methodical. That kind of clear-eyed thinking in the middle of real pain is not something that comes automatically. You have to decide to do it, and then you have to keep deciding every time the grief tries to take over. And then there is the harder thing, the thing I did not fully understand until it was over. Standing firm when standing firm costs you something. I refused my son's request for money the night he called about a medical emergency that did not exist. I heard the guilt in his voice when he said he would figure it out, and I stayed quiet. That was the loneliest moment of the whole ordeal. Not confronting Conrad in his renovated kitchen, not walking into that hospital lobby, staying quiet on the phone with my child while he suffered, because I knew that the most loving thing I could do was not give him what he was asking for. Fern, the pharmacist, took a risk for a stranger because she had learned the same lesson the hard way, that silence protects the wrong people. She did not have proof. She just had what she had seen, and she decided it was enough to say something. I brought her flowers. I would bring them again 100 times. If there is anything I want you to take from this story, it is simply this. Doing right is not always the same as doing comfortable. Sometimes it is slower, lonelier, and more frightening than anyone tells you it will be. But the things built on honesty, the relationships, the trust, the life on the other side of a hard truth, those hold. They hold in a way that nothing built on looking the other way ever can.